And welcome to the Nexus seminar series. And today is my honor to have Dr. Patrick O'Farrell with us. He's an adjunct researcher with UNU Flores and a senior lecturer at the University of Western Cape, South Africa. For the last 22 years, he has worked as a landscape ecologist, focusing on understanding socio-ecological systems within a development and conservation context. Is interested in understanding and multifunctional nature of landscape and ecosystem, and now how we can develop nature-based solution in adapting climate change and other developmental challenges. So it's my honor to give the floor to Patrick, and looking forward to hearing to your presentation.
Thanks very much, Serena. It's lovely to be here again. I don't think it's probably been a year since I last spoke to the people of Flores, so it's always wonderful to have an opportunity to talk here. Just to say, well, let me start by saying that today I'm talking about a paper that we published in Nature probably about 2 months ago, and it really addresses the diverse values of nature, which is intimately linked to kind of resource nexus issues. And so it seemed like a nice opportunity to kind of speak to those connections and to speak a bit about the paper today. I don't think it'll be a very long presentation. I hope not, unless I get really involved and I carry on speaking for more than 30 minutes. But if anyone's got any burning questions, or if something's confusing or I haven't been quite clear, please just do jump in. We can take questions at the end as well, but if there's something that's bothering people, just shout out. I'm very happy to start and keep this informal. So as I said, the topic of today's talk is really around the nexus of diverse values of nature. So how did we kind of get here? So contextualizing the issue, and hopefully you can all see my next slide. It's we know that we're in this triple planetary crisis. We have a climate change crisis, we have biodiversity loss on an unprecedented scale, which is a massive crisis, and we also have all sorts of pollutions, water, air, and land degradation that form the third critical crisis that we need to kind of tackle. Whilst these are all completely and utterly interlinked, and you can't really separate them from one another, I'm really trying to focus today mostly on the biodiversity loss aspects and trying to think what this all means. So why focus on biodiversity? Why is this important at all? If people may recognize this figure, this is something that we talked about probably a couple of years ago, or about 18 months ago, at the Nexus Forum, the Dresden Nexus Forum. And it really just demonstrates, it's a figure that shows that biodiversity is fundamental to all our sustainable development. Everything is in a sense based on it. And particularly, we've structured this according to different levels. We know that biodiversity is intimately connected to land, both in the ocean, to biodiversity in land and in the ocean, but then also, it also underpins multiple of our other development goals too. So the second level, you can quite clearly see that climate change, like particularly local climates, are impacted when we change biodiversity. So is food, so is fresh water, and so is also good health and living. And then as we kind of scale up to the third level, things do become a little bit more distant, but ultimately, biodiversity provides the underpinning for most of our sustainable development. So it's really important that we focus on this and concentrate and get it right, and we start to stem this crisis of biodiversity loss. So as you hopefully are all aware, that this is something that is at the foremost efforts of many of our global and national leaders, and we have just developed the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework for 2030. In this framework, it describes the 4 key targets that we really need to be focused on in trying to stem this loss. So it's very ambitious. And the targets really speak to biodiversity's thinking about trying to target biodiversity in inclusive spatial planning, trying to target our degraded areas and restore 30% of those, recovering those into some form of biodiversity use. It also talks about setting 30% effective targets for area-based conservation. So that simply translates as 30% of all our global areas should have some form of biodiversity conservation on them. And then we should also be targeting specific conservation actions at particular species. In terms of the second target, though, it's quite clear in that it talks about the importance of including ecosystem functions and services and making sure that these are valued and maintained and enhanced. So within this Cuming protocol, we recognize the need to start valuing biodiversity and the functions related to biodiversity. So getting these underpinnings for all our resource nexus issues right from the start. So the next obvious question, and really the focus of what I'm trying to talk about today, is, well, what do we mean when we talk about what are values? What are the values of nature in a sense? Well, values represent really what is important to us as people. You know, they tell us what we care about in a sense, and they highlight our preferences, what we prefer over what else, as well as our principles and our beliefs, what we feel needs to be done because it's important. They also provide us with an important way of measuring things, you know, and this can be in terms of volumes of things, kilograms, hectares, kilograms per hectare, tons of fish, as well as monetary values too, such as, you know, dollars for some resource or some other tourist activity, let's say. But value of nature also helps us understand human environment or human nature relationships. And it allows us to assess, you know, when we see changes in nature, how does that impact on people's quality of life? So that's kind of what I'm talking about, all these different measures of what value is when we talk about values of nature. So this was and has been a hot topic for the last 4 years, and I was involved in the IPBES, and you'll see this on all the slides, the International Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and of IPBES, the values assessment of nature, you know, how value relates to nature. We worked on this assessment for about 4 years. I think it was from about 2018 to 2022. And in that time, we came up with a lot of different findings. I think we reviewed about 50,000 pieces of literature, books and works, as well as engaged with traditional knowledge and many other different things. And from that, we came up with this fundamental understanding of this values typology, how all these things start to kind of fit together. I do realize that some of my slides are a little bit small and hard to read, but I will refer you to the Nature's paper that I mentioned at the start, because most of these figures can be found there. But now this values typology, it just demonstrates that there are multiple dimensions to understanding value. And we think of people and communities, you know, how do we understand what values they have for nature? So this figure at the top shows our example of what we mean by nature. And it's a lovely valley setting with a city and the background, as well as forests and clear waters and fishes and birds and life as we know it. But underpinning all that are people's values, firstly related to kind of worldviews and knowledge systems. And by that, what we mean are worldviews are ways of knowing which people, how they conceive and interact with the world. And knowledge systems typically speak to kind of the underlying belief systems that we have, whether these be academic or religious, or as we see there's also local understandings and belief systems. So these are our broad underlying knowledge systems. The next layer up, as you see, speaks to this notion of broad values. And broad values really speak to kind of also how we see the world. And these relate to, sure, I'm struggling to see my slides, sorry. Whether these things are anthropogenic or biocentric, or whether we have a plural view of the world. And then also the broad values, sorry, these are as we relate to this propensity we have for firewood or different other natural resources out there. The next value up speaks to specific values, and this is quite important because specific values link to how we interact with nature in certain ways. And these relate to instrumental values, how we use nature, the intrinsic values we have for nature, And this is our belief system, nature's for nature's value. Nature has a right to exist on its own and how we value that, as well as relational value with nature, how we feel about nature. So it's not just nature for nature, but our interactions with nature. So how we relate to nature, our love of landscape, so to speak. And then in addition to this very top value that you see there, these value indicators really, again, speak to the way we'd go about measuring and understanding value. And examples of this are, if we're catching fish, as you see in this catchment, these would be tons of fish that we'd be interested in, or the types of fish that we'd be trying to capture. I'm probably going to leave it there. There are a few more details there related to life value frames, and these are just kind of collections of ways of looking at all these different worldviews to specific values. The collections and baskets, not to say that people fit in completely into one or another, but they highlight these different values, highlight groups of values that seem to broadly cluster together, and they can be quite a useful way of understanding value of nature within this typology. Okay, so you can see the takeaway from this is really that there is multiple dimensions and multiple aspects to value of nature. It's very diverse, it's very plural. There's a lot of aspects to it when we need to consider what is the nature, what is the value of nature. So there are many layers to it, and there are many ways of seeing and experiencing the value of nature. So how do we relate this all to the current biodiversity crisis? Well, the IPBES Values assessment really demonstrated that values can drive transformative change. So we can use our understanding of value to make things different in a sense. In fact, if we look at values in certain ways or certain types of values, they in fact potentially offer us leverage points in which to intervene in our global socio-political and natural systems. And the study demonstrated that there are four that we should really be paying our attention to. So as I said here in the slide, value-centric approaches show promise in creating the conditions for driving transformative change. And the four areas that we particularly found to be showing promise are those related to recognizing the diversity of values of nature. So looking at all the different values people have of nature, trying to embed this understanding of diverse values within a decision-making process. So how do we actually carry out valuations, in a sense, that allow us to make good decisions? The third one relates to how do we reform policies and stimulate institutional change? So how do we do things differently? How do we change our rules and mechanisms for governance? And then the final one is really all about trying to shift our societal level norms and our goals as societies and groups of people into supporting more sustainability aligned values across all our different sectors. So a much higher level goal or target or intervention point compared to the other three. And what I'm going to do with the remainder of the presentation is really just to focus on, I'm going to take these in order, and I'm going to talk through what each of one of these things means, and just discuss each of these transformations, these potential points of intervention, should I say, in intervening in the system. Okay. So this is the first one, and as you see this figure on the left-hand side of the screen, we'll build it across, highlighting all four of these, but just to kind of start with the first one, which is, as you see here, it's about undertaking valuation exercises. It's about understanding value and recognizing the values of nature, should I say. And if we can understand that, we can start to kind of ratchet up the earth into this more sustainable and just future. So it's about recognizing the diverse values of nature. Well, just to kind of give a little bit of background and to just bring in some of the other findings related to what this means about identifying multiple values of nature from our values assessment. Well, it highlights that any individual or even social group may hold multiple values of nature. And we need to recognize that sometimes these contradict one another. So we can see contradictions within a family or within an individual or even in a community about different ways of seeing nature, and sometimes they conflict. And we also know that values change over time as well as across contexts, and these differ depending on when we measure things. So it speaks to the temporal nature of value and how it shifts. There are also values that cannot be compared to one another. So, if I hold a relational value for a certain plant or a tree, and someone else might have a completely different way of seeing that tree or that plant, that we can't trade them off against one another. We can't even bring them into the same way of comparison. We simply just have to acknowledge these values. As well as decisions are informed by the values that get prioritized. And by this, we mean that if we look at the past, we can start to see that certain types of values, particularly monetary values and the way things are measured around the instrumental use of nature and natural resources, they were way more prioritized than how we see values around relational values of nature, in a sense. So those were the ones that seemed to be prioritized and were not treated, and all values weren't treated equally within decision making. So if something seemed to hold more monetary value, it seemed to override all other types of value within decision making. We also noticed that institutions, and by this we mean the rules and norms, as I stated earlier, promote certain types of values, and they tend to neglect others. And the dominant way in which values have been reflected, mostly through production and consumption through our traditional economic means, have had negative consequences on nature. So we've seen how biodiversity has been eroded through the traditional economic approaches and valuation of resources as we've seen them, where we haven't actually looked at multiple types of value and looked at how these differ in relation to one another. We've preferenced very simple single values, which have resulted in nature being eroded in some ways. Okay, so moving towards diverse valuation. As I said, focusing on single value indicators is a risk because it ignores the multiple ways in which nature is important to people. So we need to undo that. And trying to put into context, trying to pull this all together. And we know that single units can mask other values and other actors' values of nature. So multiple approaches are really needed in moving forward. And fortunately for the IPBES process, it highlighted that there were over 50 different methods and approaches that were out there and available for us to use and basically to unpack different values of nature. So we can actually get to developing these this plural understanding of value using these multiple different approaches. We don't simply have to stick to single value approaches. Obviously, the implications to it, potentially exploring all these different values is unrealistic. But then trying to understand one aspect of value of nature, it can be very expensive and take a lot of time, but we'll get to that more in a moment. Just to kind of highlight what do we mean by all these different types of values. So here's a figure taken from the summary for policymakers from the value assessment, which highlights these different value families. So of these 50 different methods that were identified, we can see that we can roughly group them into 4 different types of values. And these were 4 value families. And these are nature-based valuations, statement-based valuations, behavior-based valuation, and then there's an integrated valuation where mixed methods have been suggested. And each one of these assesses different things. So if you look at the next row, I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it. It talks about what are the sources of information that we need. And I'll give you an example here. There's too much detail in this table to go through it all. But if we look at the first column, looking at nature-based valuation, we can see that the sources of information we'd be looking for would be around physical, ecological components of nature and how these contribute to people. We could then see what examples of methods would be used. Well, we'd do biodiversity inventories, we'd look at ecosystem service maps, we may apply Delphi methods and participatory mapping in determining ecological values. If we try something else, if we look at what would the types of information be that we'd be exploring in integrated valuation, well, different outputs would be possible using one or more methods. But the the method approaches we'd use would probably look at ecosystem service valuation, cost-benefit analysis, integrated modeling, maybe even scenario building would provide us with some of that information. Okay, just before I move on to the next slide, I do want you to consider that not only do we have these valuation method families, which stretch way from the natural through the economic and social into this integrated sense, but we also need to recognize that we need to consider the valuation by Indigenous peoples and local communities as well. And there definitely are methods that we put forward here which allow us to kind of gather information. And some of the suggested ways of doing this are through like territorial patrols to understand natural resources and their use, as well as how they're monitored by people, local and Indigenous people, also how they engage with these resources in rituals and ceremonies. And obviously this needs to be done with specialized traditional experts in conjunction with the local and Indigenous people. But there are methods and approaches, so we shouldn't just simply put that information aside and say that it can't be incorporated into our valuation approaches. Okay. Moving on to the second value point, it's the second leverage point, and this is really about trying to embed valuation into inclusive decision making. So it's how do we use this knowledge in a meaningful way and integrate it into decision making. So that's really the method. Oh, see, so sorry. So this figure speaks to the approach that we put forward in terms of embedding values into decision making. And it's quite a simple 5-step process, which really just talks about how we bring people along with us in understanding these different inputs as they relate to the value of nature. And the first step is investing in a legitimate process. So bringing people along, making sure that people agree with the process. And this is defining, first of all, the next step would be about defining the purpose. So we'd engage with participants and we'd jointly define what the intended valuation outputs should look like. We'd establish the scope of the study, identified whose values are going to be considered, hopefully, multiple different organizations or groups of values, making that plural, and how we define the temporal scale as well as the socio and biophysical boundaries of each one of these study, should I say. And then also how we choose and apply these different methods. So it's all fine in having the method, but how do we apply it? And where do we apply it? And who do we apply it to? So deciding how to scale up these individual values, how to decide on how we combine different value outputs, if at all possible, and which are the most suitable methods to apply with this question or based on what we're trying to do, the defined purpose. And then really we need to decide on about how we go about communicating results to inform decisions. And this is about being transparent in our reporting processes of the results, as well as explaining the uncertainties and the limitations, and always allowing the public to kind of contest and to engage with the material and the process. But it's all about relevance, the resources we have to do such studies, and making sure that what we do produce is as robust as possible. And only by applying these types of principles and approaches can we start to embed values into decision making. Okay, the third leverage point, the way we kind of get that lever down, you can hopefully see that as we grow across, we're potentially adding to our ability to transform our approach towards more just and sustainable futures. And this one is really about reforming policies, rights, and regulations. And it's about changing policies ultimately and getting institutions to embrace diverse values. Within the assessment, we identified that the policy cycle is obviously really quite important. The policy cycle is what you see in the center of this figure, with stakeholders at the core of it. But it's about agenda setting at the start, policy formulation, policy adoption, policy implementation, and then again, policy evaluation as we move around the cycle and start again within policy development. Okay. So we believe that values can play important roles at multiple points in the cycle. And you'll see this, slightly greeny, yellowy boxes speak to where values can be used to intervene in the cycle. However, there's a subtlety to though. So we just need to kind of look at the texture, and you can see that values have valuation can have different purposes. It can be to inform, where we raise awareness about some issue, where we advocate for something, or where it's about justice after a decision. It can also be valuation can be used to decide. It can be used to be participative. We can apply cost benefit analysis to be feasible, and it can allow us to make better decisions. And we can also use valuation in designing approaches and interventions in the policy cycle. And this can be about permitting, it can be about damage compensation, it can even be around the pricing of certain goods. So we've got these different things to inform, to decide, and to design. And if you look at the circle, you can see where these valuation intervention points potentially are. And at each one, we need to decide which of these approaches are we going to be used to intervene in the policy cycle. At the agenda setting stage, and it's really about valuation to inform, so it's providing information. At the policy adoption phase, it's really about valuation to decide. And then at other points, you can see where we might need to apply with policy implementation. We need valuation to inform, design, and decide all at the same time. So we can make lots of intervention points there. The point is to say that we are capable, and we know what we need to do, and this is an iterative process, and we can simply, start to feed our value understanding in at different points. But we must just be aware that it needs to support policy from these different perspectives, and we need to think about, are we applying it to facilitate design, or are we applying it to facilitate information uptake? Okay. Now, finally, I'm coming to my last slide here, which is just really around shifting societal levels, norms, and goals to support sustainability-aligned values across different sectors. And as you can probably imagine, that this is obviously the hardest aspect. So kind of as we kind of creep across this transformation diagram that supplies all these different leverage points for creating more just and sustainable futures, our leverage points get deeper and deeper, so we can have a greater and greater effect as we add all these different tools to our approach. Let's just go through this final one here, and we can sort of close off the discussion a little bit. But it's about shifting societal norms and goals. So it's a very hard thing to do. Before, we've talked about applying tools and techniques and approaches, really about kind of informing people around these plural valuation approaches, and thinking about how we can embed plural valuation to decision making and integrate it into policy cycles. Now we're at a point where we start talking about the need to shift society's values and norms, and how we do that. And the idea really here is about trying to mobilize sustainability-aligned values and shift development modes, the way we do things, the way we develop going forwards. Not an easy thing to do. And obviously, it requires a lot of great minds to be thinking about how we go about driving this change. Just after releasing the Nature paper, we produced a few spin-off papers, and I just wanted to highlight this one because I think there's a very good figure in it. This is about the roles of values in future scenarios, and what type of values underpinned sustainable and unsustainable futures. And it was led by Zuzana Hamakova from the Czech Republic. And in this figure, you can see what it does is it highlights all our different types of values, from nature's contributions to people, and nature for a good life, so to speak, afterwards. And it highlights these different future scenario archetypes that we looked at, from dystopian scenarios through to economic scenarios to sustainability scenarios. And the take-home message from this the very detailed analysis was that the sustainable scenarios really try to engage with multiple different types of values. They engage equally with instrumental, relational, and intrinsic values. They think about nature from a cultural services perspective, from an economic perspective, from a societal perspective, and they think about all these different material and non-material values of nature, in contrast with the dystopian and the economic optimism and business as usual case studies, which tend to really just focus on the material values of nature and our instrumental use of nature. Whilst they do engage a little bit in the other aspects, they tend not to look at them in much detail at all, the other types of values. So from this, we can start to see that plural valuation and how we engage with multiple different types of values is particularly important for potentially sustainable scenarios into the future. So, when we look at multiple different things, it potentially can lead us down sustainable pathways. And this is really just the final figure that I'd like to put up here. And it speaks to how we go about navigating towards a just and sustainable future, which is represented by our planet at the very top of the screen, and how we move, as you can see represented on the right-hand side of the figure, from the present to the future, how we kind of move into the future. At the bottom end of the screen are the different types of values that I started to kind of raise at the start. And there are these broad values as well as specific values. And these have been assigned to what could only be considered to be different communities. They could be local communities. These could be nations. These could be individual countries. But what they show is that we're all at different starting points. We all have, as our individual collectives, how we choose to assign ourselves into our different communities. We all have different baskets of underpinning values and types of values in their different forms, and the way they're constructed. So we're not all thinking the same way about the values of nature and the resources that we use. And the pathways that we potentially take to a just and sustainable future don't have to be the same. We can all potentially get there by doing slightly different things or doing very different things, as long as we're kind of mindful of the potential sustainability outcomes of our values. And what this shows is that there are multiple different pathways that these different groups, individuals, collections can take in reaching just and sustainable futures. And these pathways may be things like the green economy, they may be things like following the path of degrowth, or there could be nature conservation pathways ahead. But what they do show is an important point, I feel, where they're decision points which allow us to kind of reflect, potentially add to or take away from policy, potentially undertake studies which highlight different values of nature. And they allow for us to kind of correct our pathways, where we as researchers and scientists can make interventions into the policy space, or maybe not interventions, but we can provide information and recommendations, and possibly contribute to decision makers straightening our pathways or realigning them with our shared vision or target of future just and sustainable futures, in a sense, by thinking about those types of sustainability aligned values that we should be targeting, and thinking about the norms and goals of our society, and how potentially our role is to contribute to making those adjustments and providing some form of guidance. Serena, I'm going to stop there. I think that's my last slide. I've probably spoken for an hour, and I'll give people a chance to ask me questions and hopefully present some good ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you for this great summary and also overview on potential pathways that we should be taking in the direction of including actually biodiversity into actions for a better world, but also on smart policy-making process. So thank you for that. I have a couple of questions that come from the public. If you allow, I would read it through.
Please, yeah.
And what would be the best approach of sampling in order to capture the information, especially diverse community, to a study at the regional level? That's from our colleague at Flores. Flores, it's yours.
It obviously depends on what resources you have to hand, how you would go about designing your sampling strategy. But as a researcher, a well-established researcher, or even maybe a young researcher who could be doing a PhD or a postdoc, I'm not sure, but sampling strategies are everything. I think what our study and what the work out there in trying to understand this plural value of nature is that we potentially need to engage beyond single method approaches. So we should be really, at the minimum, engaging with mixed methods that allow us to explore and potentially contrast our findings and our sampling strategies and the results. We need to engage with as many broad groups of stakeholders as possible. So increasing our sampling size in order to ensure that we are capturing a full understanding of a community or multiple communities' different values. So we need good cross sections across our landscapes so that plural values can emerge. If we don't do that, we run the risk of simply just hearing the dominant voices and not allowing the values of marginalized groups and communities to actually be heard and to be expressed and to be held up in equal weighting as other values. So I think the key is really to try and be as expansive in our sampling strategy within reason as possible. I think it requires some clever thinking and agility to ensure that small budgets can be stretched. But in particular, I think trying to engage with those different families of techniques, the nature, the social values, the interview values, and possibly even, engaging with local communities in detail and understanding their perceptions is critical. So really using all the different types of methods and applying them as best as possible.
Thank you. Next question comes as also amplifying, elaborating more on methodology. So is it possible to integrate all methods that you have just you have mentioned it to get a single value that could be used, such as a carbon credit, or allowing developing project for compensation? So what things should be considered in time, and how we can combine such methods? I think that's very broad, and we could speak a lot about it.
Yeah, so the question would be more, why would we want to combine methods? And certainly, why would we want to combine values? I don't think anywhere people are recommending this. I think that was old thinking, where we need to come up with a single value that allows us to say this is more important because our numbers say this value is more than that value. I think now we're at a stage where we apply multiple different methods and into different situations, and we come up with different types of values that can't actually, they're incommensurable. They can't be put together. They can't be contrasted. It's like comparing an Apple with a Volkswagen car. They're like two totally different things. And we need to first of all elicit what the values are. We need to see what the values are. We need to understand kind of what the playing field of values is, so to speak. So we need to understand if it's apples and bananas and Volkswagen cars and computer screens or whatever it is, and then go back to people and talk about how do we go and move forward into the space of just and sustainable futures based on our collective understanding of what all the values are that are being held, and not in a sense to try trade off one value off against one another, but to hold them there and to be in this very, very uncomfortable space where you can't say, okay, this, it's not, this value outdoes that value. This is more than that. This community's right to this watershed is trumped by the need for big business to access water. It shouldn't really be about that. It should be about trying to understand the plurality of the value space and people's understanding of nature and their values for nature. So not just about making quick and easy trade-offs. I do think that there is some scope for applying integrated methods to good effect. And I think there's an entire collection of value methods that are outlined in chapter 2 of our values assessment. There's probably about 120 pages that you can go and read, which describe each method in great detail, as well as the integration of different methods. I obviously don't have the time to go into those here now, nor probably the understanding. It wasn't a chapter I worked on, but it's probably the best single place to kind of start your investigations into looking at the integration or mixed method approaches to eliciting value.
Thank you. We have a couple of more questions. One comes from: valuation is always challenging in natural resource management. So I would be curious to know about valuation method that you have adopted, whether it's transferable to other type of studies, such as looking at water in society, economy, environment, and similar.
Absolutely. I think the value methods that are put forward within this assessment are very broad and wide-ranging. They speak around natural resource use, and I think the examples that you put forward there around water and water in society can certainly be captured by not all, but some of these methods. I think what's valuable in these methods is that they speak to the notion that, say, water in society or water for a community can be valued in multiple different ways. So it can be valued from the amount of economic revenue that could be generated from the use of that water. You can grow crops, you can create electricity, but it can also speak to the notion of the river system and the catchment and how people relate to the space in which they live, the emotional, the cultural, the religious perspectives that cannot be translated into a monetary valuation. It's much more about importance and how these areas and their connection to places makes them feel, which don't translate into a monetary value. So the methods that are put forward are not specifically, they're quite broad, should I say. They don't just speak to one type of resource use or nature over another. I think they can be looked at in multiple contexts. They're very broad. They even go into kind of health aspects. So we'd probably you'd find ways of looking at how people's health relates to clean water, and methods and metrics of assessing health-related outcomes of fresh and clean water within a catchment. So, they really are quite plural and quite diverse. So I too encourage you to go and explore and think widely about the methods of application.
Thank you. Now we have one last question that relates. So, is there any available data for valuation which can be used for certain area, like land use map? Want to have a look at valuation, but don't have funds to go and collect data. So in case of no possibility of data collection, is there any way to overcome the sampling?
Yeah, so that is a good question, and it's certainly a position that we all find ourselves in at some point. Trying to go out and assess value when you can't go into the field and you can't speak to people and you want to understand a landscape. I don't know. The simple point is that different areas of the world have had value studies undertaken in different ways and into different levels of intensity. So I know that from my own experience, we can see that, the Americas, or the North Americas and lots of Europe, many parts of Europe have had a lot of intense studies in valuation studies from land use change perspectives or land use perspectives, looking at multiple different aspects. And a lot of that data is available online and can be sourced from publications as well as online data sets. In other parts of the world, Africa, South America, much less studies. In fact, in some areas, in Central Africa, we find almost absolutely no valuation studies at all. So it's very hard to do. So what do you do in those instances? The notion of the economic approach would be to use value transfer approaches, where you say, well, this area is very much like that area where we do have information for, so we'll just simply transfer those values. That's one aspect, and I won't talk about the merits of such an approach. I think it great deal of caution is required when one does such things, and you certainly need to be very clear and explicit, and that's what you're doing. I think we need to think of novel ways of trying to raise values, and not just thinking about the monetary values. I think you need to be exploratory in looking at the different data layers that are potentially out there. So, look at land cover maps, look at cropping maps, understand tons per hectare of certain crops, try and understand health aspects, look at census data. Be aware that there are a lot of global data sets out there that do cover almost all the world in some detail as they relate to food, populations, land cover. But then know that when you disaggregate global data down to a local level, your scale doesn't necessarily, the resolution of your data doesn't increase, or it's not very good, and you need to always say that this is the information that you're using and it's potentially unreliable. So that would be my advice. Look at as broadly as you can at as many different sources as you can, and try to find ways of manipulating data sensibly and honestly and transparently into trying to come up with values from novel perspectives. But very hard, but always be honest and transparent in the data and approaches that you've used.
Thank you. I really hope that has been exhaustive. If you're not, you know how to reach out to Patrick.
Absolutely.
I'm sure that he will provide us more information on that. And thank you really much for that. Do we have any other questions from the... yes, we have one last question. We are still on time. So as we have the possibility to ask an author publishing Nature, I would like to take the chance to ask some general question. Which theory did you apply, and how could you relate them to the subject? And secondly, how did you approach to come from data to results and discussion? So the process actually to make a successful Nature publication.
Sure. The process. So this was a very difficult process. As I say, the Nature paper came out of 4 years of work that involved, there are probably about 86 of us engaged in the study. I think the people who did the writing, I think there were 22 of us that actually manually sat down and wrote the Nature paper and did the figures for it. We did draw on the remaining expertise from the other lead authors from the assessment, and we drew on work from the assessment. The way we went about it really was a lot of workshops and kind of battling it out with draft after draft after draft, as I said, amongst 22 of us, where we would kind of go around in circles and do a lot of arguing about what the key message was, what we were trying to, what were our key findings from the data, how we could build up those key findings in a logical, coherent story that was most relevant and pertinent for the audience that we were targeting. And I think it was just a slow, deliberative approach. In terms of the theory that we were targeting, I can't really reach in and tell you what the theory was. It was more, at the heart of the analysis and the kind of driver behind the Nature paper was the need to demonstrate the fact that, we've really been too narrowly focused in our valuation and analyses of the values of nature in the past, and was really to get the world to recognize that there's different ways of doing it. So we needed to, in a sense, tip a theory on its head, to tackle a well-established ecological economic theory and demonstrate that it wasn't performing effectively, and that actually we needed to be way more transdisciplinary, and that we needed to push the notion of engaging with stakeholders much, much harder into the space of value for nature. I think I'm going to leave it there, and I think if you want to, whoever asked the question, to read the Nature paper and possibly look at the summary for policymakers, and then I'd welcome you to start a conversation with me, and I can give you further insights in that way. But I think that's all I could say for now.
Thank you for that. And that was, I think, one of the curiosities that many of us had it. So thank you also, Matthias,
Also a whole
for
lot of good
sharing
luck.
that.
It's random luck as well.
That's also true. I have to say that it depends, not luck, but right reviewers. I think they need to share with you a vision that you have of the matter and how it's presented. So, but thank you.
In terms of that, there were about 6 reviewers. I've never known so many reviews, and there were about 4 rounds of review as well. So crazy. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. But congratulations again. That said, I would like to close the Nexus seminar, but at the same time, I would like to, on behalf of myself and here with Samanti, which is the co-coordinator here of the Nexus seminar, to invite you to the next seminar series, which will be in about a month. And Samanti, if you want to say as well the last words, I'll be happy to give the closing to you.
Thank you, Serena. So just for some of us, so this is a always open invitation seminar, but there is also a special group of students participating that are part of our course that we are co-teaching, Serena and I. So those are joining for the very first time for a seminar, which is now in a quite progressed over the last couple of decades. And so next time we will have Lager Blagojev, I believe, joining, who's a professor of organization at TU Dresden, and who will share with us some of his insights with regard to sustainability and the sustainability of Nexus in general. With this, I would like to say thank you as well, Patrick, to you for the insights today, and invite everyone to join for our next session.
Bye, everyone, and have a good afternoon, day, wherever you are located on. Bye.